Welcome to True Crime Open and Closed, where the darkest secrets refuse to stay buried. I'm your host, and what I'm about to tell you will chill you to the bone. Picture this: a sweltering June night in 1912. A family sleeps peacefully in their beds, trusting in the safety of their quiet Iowa town. By dawn, 8 people are dead. This isn't just another murder case. This is something far more sinister. In Villisca, Iowa, the Moore family went to bed on June 9th as respected members of their community, Josiah and Sarah, loving parents, their 4 innocent children, 2 young guests who'd been invited for what should have been a fun sleepover. None of them would see another sunrise. What happened in that house defied all logic. The killer didn't just commit murder, he did something else. Something so bizarre that investigators have spent more than a century trying to understand it. Who was this monster? What drove him to such unspeakable evil? How did he slip away so completely that after hundreds of suspects and countless investigations, we still don't know his name? Tonight, we're going inside the house where it happened. We're uncovering the truth behind America's most terrifying unsolved mystery. Welcome to True Crime Open and Closed. Prologue: The darkness that came to Villisca. In the heartland of America, where corn grows tall and communities are bound by trust and tradition, there exists a small town in southwestern Iowa called Villisca. With a population of just over 2,000 souls in 1912, it was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played safely in the streets, and where doors were rarely locked. It was a town that believed in the fundamental goodness of humanity, a belief that would be shattered forever on one horrific night in June. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders, a crime so brutal, so inexplicable, that it would haunt not only the small Iowa community but capture the imagination of an entire nation. It is a tale of 8 innocent lives lost, of a killer who vanished into the night like a specter, and of a mystery that has endured for more than a century, defying every attempt at resolution. The events that unfolded in the early morning hours of June 10, 1912, would transform Villisca from a peaceful farming community into the setting of one of America's most notorious unsolved crimes. The victims were the Moore family and 2 young guests, their lives cut short by an unknown assailant wielding the family's own axe. The killer moved through the house with methodical precision, leaving behind a scene so disturbing that seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend the mind capable of such violence. Chapter 1: A town built on trust. To understand the magnitude of what happened in Villisca, one must first understand the nature of the community itself. In the early 20th century, Villisca was a thriving agricultural town, its prosperity built on the rich black soil of Iowa and the hard work of its residents. The town was laid out in a neat grid pattern, with tree-lined streets bearing names like 4th and 5th, Lincoln and Broad. White picket fences surrounded modest but well-maintained homes, and the sound of children's laughter was as common as the whistle of the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy Railroad that brought commerce and connection to the outside world. The social fabric of Villisca was woven together by shared values, common struggles, and mutual dependence. Farmers relied on merchants, merchants relied on the railroad, and everyone relied on each other. The town boasted several churches, a school that served as the center of community gatherings, and businesses that formed the economic backbone of the area. It was a place where a man's word was his bond, where children were raised by the entire community, and where the concept of senseless violence was as foreign as the languages spoken in distant lands. The Moore family was an integral part of this community tapestry. Josiah Burton Moore, known to friends and family as Joe, was a successful businessman who had built his fortune through hard work and shrewd investments. Born in 1868, Joe had come to Villisca as a young man and established himself first as a traveling salesman, then as a partner in the local John Deere implement dealership. His success allowed him to provide well for his family, and the Moores occupied a position of respect and prominence in the town's social hierarchy. Sarah Montgomery Moore, Joe's beloved wife, was the embodiment of the ideal early 20th century mother and homemaker. Born in 1870, she had married Joe in 1899, and together they had created a warm and loving home for their 4 children. Sarah was known for her kindness, her involvement in church activities, and her devotion to her family. She was the type of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who brought meals to sick neighbors, and who opened her home to children who needed a safe place to stay. The Moore children were the pride and joy of their parents' lives. Herman Montgomery Moore, the eldest at 11 years old, was a bright and responsible boy who helped his father with chores and looked after his younger siblings. Catherine, who would have turned 10 just 5 days after the murders, was a sweet-natured girl with her mother's gentle disposition. Boyd, age 7, was full of the energy and curiosity typical of boys his age, always ready for an adventure or mischief. The youngest, Paul Vernon, was only 5 years old, still at that age where the world was full of wonder and every day brought new discoveries. On the night of June 9, 1912, the Moore family was not alone. 2 young guests had been invited to stay overnight. Ina Mae Stillinger, age 8, and her sister, Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 12. The Stillinger girls were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, family friends who lived in Villisca. It was not uncommon for children to spend nights at friends' houses, and the Moore home was known as a place where young visitors were always welcome. Chapter 2. The Day Before Darkness. June 9, 1912, dawned bright and clear in Villisca, Iowa. It was a Sunday, and like most Sundays in this devoutly Christian community, it would be spent in worship, fellowship, and family togetherness. The Moore family began their day as they always did, with breakfast together around their dining room table, followed by preparation for the morning church service. The Presbyterian Church, where the Moores were active members, was located just a few blocks from their home on East 2nd Street. The white wooden structure with its tall steeple was a landmark in the small town, and on this particular Sunday morning, it would be filled with families gathering for worship and the special Children's Day program that had been planned for weeks. Joe Moore, dressed in his Sunday best, walked with his family through the tree-lined streets of Villisca. At 43 years old, he was in the prime of his life, a man who had achieved the American dream through hard work and determination. His success in the farm implement business had allowed him to provide his family with a comfortable 2-story home, good food, and the security that came with financial stability. As they walked to church that morning, Joe had every reason to believe that his future, and that of his family, was bright and secure. Sarah Moore, walking beside her husband with their 4 children, embodied the grace and dignity expected of a prominent businessman's wife. At 42, she remained attractive and vital, her dark hair neatly arranged beneath her Sunday hat, her dress modest but fashionable. She was known throughout Villisca as a woman of strong moral character, deeply religious, and completely devoted to her family. The sight of the Moore family walking to church together that morning was a picture of domestic harmony and community respectability. The Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church was a special event that had been anticipated for weeks. Children from the congregation had prepared recitations, songs, and performances to celebrate their faith and demonstrate what they had learned in Sunday school. The Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, were among the children participating in the program, and it was their involvement that would lead to the invitation that sealed their fate. After the morning worship service, the Moore family returned home for Sunday dinner, a leisurely meal that was an important family tradition. The afternoon was spent in quiet pursuits, typical of the Sabbath, reading, visiting with neighbors, and preparing for the evening program back at the church. As the sun began to set over the Iowa countryside, families once again made their way to the Presbyterian Church for the Children's Day exercises. The evening program was a success, with proud parents watching as their children performed songs and recitations they had practiced for weeks. The Stillinger sisters gave particularly memorable performances, and when the program concluded around 9:30 in the evening, Sarah Moore extended an invitation that seemed perfectly natural at the time. Would Lena and Ina like to come home with the Moore family and spend the night? The girls were delighted with the invitation, and their parents readily agreed. As the congregation dispersed into the warm June night, many stopping to chat with friends and neighbors on the church steps, No one could have imagined that 8 of their number would not live to see another sunrise. The Moore family, accompanied by their young guests, walked home through the quiet streets of Villisca, passing under the soft glow of the newly installed electric streetlights that had brought modernity to their small town. Chapter 3. The Last Hours of Innocence. The walk home from the Presbyterian Church on the evening of June 9, 1912, was filled with the innocent chatter of children excited about their successful performances and the prospect of an unexpected sleepover. Lena and Ina Stillinger skipped alongside the Moore children, their voices mixing with the sounds of a summer evening in small-town Iowa, the chirping of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, and the occasional clip-clop of a horse and buggy making its way through the streets. The Moore home at 5080 2nd Street was a modest but comfortable 2-story white house, typical of middle-class dwellings in early 20th century Iowa. The house sat on a corner lot, surrounded by a white picket fence and shaded by mature elm trees. A front porch provided a welcoming entrance, while the backyard offered space for the children to play and Sarah to tend her garden. It was the kind of home that represented the American dream, a place where a hard-working man could provide security and comfort for his family. As the family and their guests entered the house that evening, they followed the routines that had become second nature over years of family life. The children were instructed to change into their night clothes, while Sarah and Joe secured the house for the night. In 1912, the concept of home security was vastly different from what it would become in later decades. Doors were often left unlocked, windows remained open for ventilation during the warm summer months, and the idea that danger might lurk in the darkness outside was foreign to most residents of Villisca. The sleeping arrangements for the night were organized with the practical efficiency typical of large families of the era. Herman, the 11-year-old son, was given a bed in the downstairs guest room, while his parents occupied their bedroom on the first floor. The 3 girls, Catherine Moore and the 2 Stillinger sisters, were assigned to a bedroom upstairs, sharing the space with the easy camaraderie of childhood friendships. Boyd and Paul, the 2 younger Moore boys, were settled in another upstairs bedroom, where they could whisper and giggle themselves to sleep as brothers often do. As the house settled into the quiet rhythms of bedtime, Joe Moore made his final rounds, checking doors and windows with the casual attention of a man who had never had reason to fear for his family's safety. The kerosene lamps were extinguished one by one, leaving the house in the gentle darkness of a summer night. Outside, Villisca slumbered peacefully, its residents secure in their beds, trusting in the fundamental goodness of their community and the protection that came from living among neighbors who had known each other for years. Sometime after midnight, as the town clock chimed the late hour, and most of Villisca's citizens were deep in sleep, a figure moved through the darkness toward the Moore house. Whether this person was a stranger to the community or someone known to the family remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. What is certain is that this individual came prepared for violence, armed with murderous intent and a knowledge of the house's layout that suggests either careful observation or previous familiarity with the property. The killer's entry into the Moore house was accomplished with a stealth that speaks to either great care or intimate knowledge of the family's habits. No signs of forced entry were found, suggesting that doors may have been left unlocked, a common practice in the trusting community of Villisca, or that the intruder possessed keys or knew of an unlocked entrance. The absence of any evidence of struggle at the point of entry indicates that the family remained unaware of the danger that had invaded their home until it was too late. Chapter 4. The Hour of Horror. What transpired in the Moore house during the dark hours of June 10, 1912, represents one of the most brutal and inexplicable crimes in American history. The events that unfolded between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning would leave 8 innocent people dead and create a mystery that would baffle investigators for more than a century. The killer's first target appears to have been Joe and Sarah Moore, who were sleeping in their first-floor bedroom. The attack came without warning. The victim struck down while they lay sleeping and defenseless. The weapon used was the family's own axe, taken from the backyard chopping block where Joe had left it after splitting kindling for Sarah's cook stove. The symbolism of using the family's own tool against them would not be lost on investigators, who would spend countless hours trying to understand the mind capable of such calculated brutality. The attack on the adult Moors was swift and decisive, suggesting that the killer understood the necessity of neutralizing the family's protectors before moving on to the children. Joe Moore, despite being struck while sleeping, showed evidence of having attempted to defend himself and his family. The position of his body and the pattern of injuries indicated that he had tried to rise from his bed, perhaps awakened by the first blow, before being overwhelmed by his attacker. Sarah Moore's injuries told a similar story of desperate struggle against an enemy who had every advantage of surprise and preparation. The savagery of the attack was evident in the number and nature of the wounds inflicted, far beyond what would have been necessary to cause death. This overkill suggested a killer driven by rage, hatred, or some form of psychological compulsion that demanded not just the victims' deaths, but their complete destruction. After completing the murders in the master bedroom, the killer moved upstairs to where the children slept. The narrow staircase of the Moore house would have creaked under the weight of an ascending figure, but if any of the children were awakened by the sound, they had no time to cry out or flee. The killer moved from room to room with methodical precision, striking down each child as they lay sleeping in their beds. Herman Moore, the eldest son sleeping in the downstairs guest room, was the only victim found outside of the family's immediate sleeping areas. His body was discovered in a different position from the others, leading some investigators to theorize that he may have been awakened by the sounds of violence upstairs and attempted to investigate or escape before being caught by the killer. The 11-year-old boy's courage in possibly trying to help his family, even in the face of mortal danger, would become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case. The three girls, Catherine Moore, Lena Stillinger, and Ina Stillinger, were found in the upstairs bedroom where they had been sleeping peacefully just hours before. The scene in this room was particularly disturbing to investigators, not only because of the ages of the victims, but because of evidence suggesting that the killer had spent considerable time arranging and rearranging the bodies after death. This post-mortem activity would become one of the most puzzling aspects of the case, raising questions about the killer's psychological state and motivations. Boyd and Paul Moore, ages 7 and 5 respectively, were discovered in another upstairs bedroom. These youngest victims of the massacre had likely never awakened from their innocent sleep, struck down while lost in the dreams of childhood. The sight of these small bodies would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives, serving as a stark reminder of the absolute evil that had visited Villisca that night. Chapter 5. The Killer's Ritual. One of the most disturbing and puzzling aspects of the Villisca murders was the killer's behavior after completing the deadly attacks. Rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime, the murderer remained in the house for what investigators estimated to be several hours, engaging in activities that revealed a deeply disturbed psychological profile. Throughout the house, the killer had methodically covered every mirror with clothing, towels, or pieces of fabric. This ritual covering of reflective surfaces was accomplished with almost obsessive attention to detail. Not a single mirror in the entire house was left uncovered. Investigators would debate the meaning of this behavior for decades. Some theorized that the killer was superstitious, believing in folk tales about mirrors trapping souls or revealing the presence of the dead. Others suggested a more psychological explanation, that the killer could not bear to see his own reflection after committing such heinous acts. The windows throughout the house were also covered, using curtains, blankets, and any available fabric to block out the outside world. This systematic elimination of any connection between the interior of the house and the external environment created a sealed chamber of death, cut off from the normal world of the living. The darkness created by these coverings may have provided the killer with a sense of security, reducing the risk of being observed by neighbors or passers-by, but the thoroughness of the covering suggested motivations that went beyond mere practical concerns. In the kitchen, investigators discovered one of the most bizarre and unexplained elements of the crime scene. A piece of bacon had been placed next to each of the victims, laid out with the same methodical care that had characterized the covering of mirrors and windows. The bacon had been taken from the Moore's own larder, sliced with a knife found in the kitchen, and arranged in a pattern that suggested ritual significance to the killer. The meaning of the bacon placement has never been satisfactorily explained. Some investigators theorize that it was intended as some form of offering or religious ritual, though no known religious practices involve such symbolism. Others suggested that the killer was attempting to create a false clue, perhaps trying to implicate someone of a particular ethnic or religious background who might be prohibited from handling pork products. The most disturbing theory was that the placement of the bacon was simply another manifestation of the killer's psychological disturbance, a compulsion to arrange and control the death scene according to some internal logic known only to the murderer. The killer also appeared to have spent time in the house's kitchen, consuming food and drink from the family's supplies. Evidence suggested that the murderer had prepared and eaten a meal, calmly sitting at the Moore family's table while surrounded by the carnage he had created. This behavior indicated either a complete absence of remorse and human emotion or a psychological state so disturbed that normal responses to violence and death were completely absent. Perhaps most chilling of all was the evidence that the killer had taken time to wash the blood from his hands and the murder weapon using the family's own wash basin and soap. This cleanup was not thorough enough to eliminate forensic evidence, but it demonstrated a level of calculation and cold-bloodedness that was almost incomprehensible to investigators accustomed to crimes of passion or desperation. The axe used in the murders was found leaning against the wall in the downstairs guest room where Herman Moore's body was discovered. The weapon had been cleaned but not thoroughly, and forensic examination would later reveal traces of blood and hair from multiple victims. The casual placement of the murder weapon suggested that the killer felt no need to dispose of evidence or hide his involvement in the crime, a confidence that would prove justified as the investigation struggled to identify any viable suspects. Chapter 6. Dawn Brings Discovery. The morning of June 10, 1912, dawned bright and clear over Villisca, Iowa, with no indication of the horror that awaited discovery in the Moore house on East 2nd Street. The town awakened to what appeared to be another ordinary Monday, with farmers preparing for their daily chores, merchants opening their stores, and children getting ready for school. The peaceful routine of small-town life would soon be shattered by a discovery that would haunt the community for generations. The first person to realize that something was amiss was Mary Peckman, the Moore's next-door neighbor. Mary had developed a friendship with Sarah Moore over the years. They had lived adjacent to each other, and it was her custom to see Sarah working in her garden or hanging laundry on the line by mid-morning on any given day. As the hours passed, and there was no sign of activity from the Moore house, Mary began to feel a growing sense of unease. By 8:30 in the morning, Mary's concern had grown strong enough to prompt action. She walked to the Moore house and knocked on the front door, calling out Sarah's name and receiving no response. The silence from within the house was complete and unnatural. No sounds of children getting ready for school, no movement from adults beginning their daily routines, no responses to her increasingly urgent calls. Mary Peckman's next step was to contact Ross Moore, Joe Moore's brother, who lived elsewhere in Villisca. Ross was known to have a key to his brother's house and would be able to investigate the situation more thoroughly. When Ross arrived at the Moore house shortly after 9 o'clock that morning, he shared Mary's growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The complete silence from a house that should have been bustling with the activity of a large family was deeply disturbing. Ross Moore used his key to enter the house through the front door, calling out to his brother as he stepped into the front hallway. The interior of the house was dark, all the windows having been covered during the night by the killer, and Ross had to wait for his eyes to adjust before he could see clearly. What he saw, when his vision adapted to the dim light, would remain burned in his memory for the rest of his life. The first body Ross discovered was that of his brother Joe, lying in the master bedroom in a pool of congealed blood. The savage nature of the injuries was immediately apparent, and Ross realized that he was looking at the scene of a brutal murder. His first instinct was to check for other victims, and as he moved through the house, the full scope of the tragedy became apparent. Room by room, Ross Moore discovered the bodies of the entire family and their young guests. Each victim showed evidence of having been struck multiple times with a heavy, sharp instrument, and the amount of blood throughout the house indicated that the attacks had been carried out with savage intensity. The sight of the children's bodies was particularly devastating, and Ross was forced to step outside the house to regain his composure before he could continue his grim survey. By 9:15 that morning, Rossmore had confirmed that all 8 occupants of the house were dead, victims of what was clearly a deliberate and brutal massacre. He immediately ran to the nearest neighbor's house to telephone the local authorities, his voice shaking as he attempted to describe what he had discovered. Within minutes, word of the tragedy began to spread through Villisca, carried by telephone calls and breathless messengers who could barely believe the reports they were sharing. Marshal Hank Horton was the first law enforcement official to arrive at the Moore house, followed shortly by Mayor Dunham and several members of the town council. The local officials were completely unprepared for a crime of this magnitude and brutality. Villisca had never experienced anything more serious than occasional drunk and disorderly conduct or petty theft, and the sight of 8 murder victims left the town's leadership in a state of shock and confusion. As news of the murders spread throughout Villisca and the surrounding area, crowds of curious onlookers began to gather around the Moore house. The concept of crime scene preservation was not well understood in 1912, and dozens of people tramped through the house during the first few hours after the discovery, contaminating evidence and making the subsequent investigation far more difficult than it might have been. Chapter 7. A Community in Shock. The news of the Moore family murders spread through Villisca like wildfire, carried by telephone calls, telegraph messages, and word of mouth. By noon on June 10, 1912, the entire town was aware that 8 people had been brutally murdered during the night, including 4 children and 2 young guests who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The shock and disbelief that gripped the community was unlike anything that had ever been experienced in this quiet Iowa farming town. The Villisca National Bank closed its doors for the day as a mark of respect, and businesses throughout the town either closed entirely or operated with skeleton crews as owners and employees struggled to comprehend what had happened. The local school dismissed classes early when teachers realized that students were too distracted and upset to focus on their lessons. Children who had played with the Moore children just days before now had to grapple with the reality that their friends would never return to school, never join them for games in the park, never grow up to fulfill the dreams and ambitions that had seemed so certain just hours before. The Presbyterian Church, where the Moore family had worshipped and where the children had performed so beautifully just the night before, became an informal gathering place for community members seeking comfort and trying to make sense of the tragedy. Reverend Lynn George Kelly, the visiting minister who had delivered the previous evening's Children's Day program, found himself counseling devastated parishioners who struggled to understand how such evil could exist in their peaceful community. The Stillinger family was particularly devastated by the loss of their 2 daughters. Joseph and Sarah Stillinger had entrusted their children to the care of the Moore family, never imagining that what seemed like an innocent sleepover would result in their daughters' deaths. The guilt and anguish experienced by the surviving family members would be compounded by the knowledge that their children had died not in the safety of their own home, but as guests in what should have been a secure environment. As details of the crime scene became known throughout the community, fear began to replace shock as the dominant emotion gripping Villisca. If a killer could strike at one of the town's most prominent and respected families, no one was safe. The fact that the murderer remained at large, his identity unknown and his motives unclear, created a sense of vulnerability that was completely foreign to residents who had never locked their doors or worried about the safety of their children playing outside after dark. Hardware stores throughout Montgomery County experienced an unprecedented run on locks, bolts, and other security devices as residents rushed to fortify their homes against a threat they didn't understand but feared might strike again. Families who had never owned firearms suddenly found themselves shopping for guns and ammunition, determined to protect themselves and their children from whatever evil had visited their community. The local newspaper, the Villisca Review, struggled to find appropriate language to describe the tragedy that had befallen their community. Editor Frank Fernando found himself attempting to report the facts of the case while also trying to maintain some sense of dignity and respect for the victims and their families. The challenge of covering such a story in a small community where everyone knew the victims personally added an emotional dimension to the journalism that would be difficult for outsiders to understand. As news of the murders spread beyond Villisca, reporters from larger newspapers in Des Moines, Omaha, and even Chicago began arriving in town, drawn by the sensational nature of the crime and the mystery surrounding the killer's identity. The influx of outside reporters and curiosity seekers created additional stress for a community already struggling to cope with tragedy and loss. The investigation into the murders began almost immediately, but the local authorities were woefully unprepared for a case of this complexity and magnitude. Marshal Hank Horton, whose previous law enforcement experience had been limited to maintaining order during the occasional Saturday night disturbance, found himself in charge of what would become one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in American history. Chapter 8. The investigation begins. The investigation into the Villisca Axe murders began in chaos and confusion, hampered by the limited experience of local law enforcement officials and the complete absence of established procedures for handling a crime of such magnitude. Marshal Hank Horton, faced with the most serious criminal case in Villisca's history, immediately recognized that he would need assistance from more experienced investigators if there was any hope of solving the murders. The Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation, such as it existed in 1912, was a far cry from the sophisticated forensic organizations that would develop in later decades. The concept of scientific crime scene investigation was still in its infancy, and techniques that would later become standard practice, fingerprint analysis, blood typing, ballistics examination, were either unknown or not widely available to rural law enforcement agencies. The first major investigator to arrive in Villisca was Detective James Newton Wilkerson from the Burns International Detective Agency, a private organization that had been hired by the Moore family's relatives to supplement the local investigation. Wilkerson was an experienced investigator who had worked on numerous high-profile cases, but even he was shocked by the brutality and apparent randomness of the Villisca murders. Wilkerson's initial examination of the crime scene revealed several important clues that would shape the direction of the investigation. The killer had clearly spent considerable time in the house after completing the murders, engaging in the bizarre ritual behaviors that had left mirrors covered and bacon placed beside each victim. The absence of any signs of forced entry suggested that the killer had either possessed a key to the house or had been admitted by someone who knew and trusted him. The murder weapon, the Moore family's own axe, had been left at the scene, apparently cleaned but still bearing traces of forensic evidence. The decision to use the family's own tool rather than bringing a weapon from outside suggested either a crime of opportunity or a killer who was intimately familiar with the property and knew where to find suitable implements of crime of opportunity. Violence. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the complete absence of any apparent motive for the murders. Joe Moore was known to be a successful businessman, but robbery did not appear to be the killer's objective. Money and valuable jewelry were left untouched throughout the house, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. The systematic nature of the killing suggested careful planning rather than a random burglary gone wrong. The sexual assault theory was also investigated and largely dismissed. While the positioning of some of the victims had initially raised suspicions about possible sexual motivations, medical examination of the bodies did not reveal evidence of such assault. The killer's behavior appeared to be driven by some other compulsion, one that investigators struggled to understand or categorize. As the investigation progressed, attention began to focus on identifying individuals who might have harbored grudges against the Moore family, or who had exhibited suspicious behavior in the days leading up to the murders. Joe Moore's business dealings were examined for evidence of conflicts that might have escalated to violence, but no clear enemies emerged from this line of inquiry. The investigation also explored the possibility that the killer was someone known to the family, someone who had been welcomed into the house and had used that trust to gain access to his victims. This theory was supported by the lack of forced entry and the killer's apparent familiarity with the house's layout. But it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of trust and safety in small-town America. Dozens of potential suspects were identified and investigated during the first weeks after the murders. Traveling salesmen who had been in the area, former employees of Joe Moore's business, individuals with histories of mental illness or violence, all came under scrutiny as investigators cast an ever-widening net in their search for the killer. The investigation was complicated by the contamination of the crime scene that had occurred in the hours immediately following the discovery of the bodies. Well-meaning neighbors, curious onlookers, and even some of the investigators themselves had tramped through the house, potentially destroying or altering evidence that might have provided crucial clues to the killer's identity. Chapter 9: Suspects and Theories. As the investigation into the Villisca Axe murders progressed through the summer of 1912, investigators developed numerous theories about the killer's identity and motives. The complete absence of clear evidence pointing to any single suspect led to a proliferation of possibilities, each seemingly as plausible as the next, but none strong enough to result in a conviction that would stand up in court. One of the earliest and most persistent theories centered on Reverend Lynn George Kelly, the visiting minister who had conducted the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church on the evening before the murders. Kelly had arrived in Villisca just days before the tragedy, ostensibly to fill in for the regular pastor who was away on vacation. His presence in town at the time of the murders, combined with certain aspects of his behavior and background, made him a natural focus of investigative attention. Kelly's behavior in the days following the murders struck many observers as unusual and suspicious. Rather than expressing the grief and shock that would be expected from a man of the cloth confronted with such tragedy, Kelly seemed oddly detached and clinical in his discussions of the crime. He showed an unusual interest in the details of the murders and the investigation, asking questions that some found inappropriate and spending considerable time at the crime scene when he had no official reason to be there. Investigation into Kelly's background revealed a history of erratic behavior and possible mental instability. He had been dismissed from previous ministerial positions under circumstances that were never fully explained, and there were reports of inappropriate behavior toward children in his previous congregations. The discovery that Kelly had been in other towns where similar axe murders had occurred added to the suspicions surrounding him, though establishing definitive connections between these crimes proved impossible. Another major suspect was Frank Fernando Jones, a wealthy businessman and former employer of Joe Moore. Jones had been involved in a bitter business dispute with Moore several years before the murders, a conflict that had resulted in Moore leaving Jones's employment to start his own competing business. The animosity between the two men was well known in Villisca, and some residents believed that Jones harbored enough resentment to seek violent revenge. Jones had an alibi for the night of the murders. He claimed to have been at home with his family, but investigators noted that his alibi was provided primarily by family members whose testimony might not be considered entirely objective. Jones's wealth and influence in the community made him a difficult suspect to pursue aggressively, and some residents suspected that the investigation was deliberately avoiding thorough examination of his possible involvement. The theory that Jones might have hired someone to commit the murders on his behalf gained some traction among investigators who believed that the businessman was too calculating to have carried out such a brutal crime personally. This theory suggested that Jones had arranged for a professional killer to eliminate the Moore family, using his knowledge of their habits and routines to provide the assassin with the information needed to carry out the attack. A third major suspect was William Blackie Mansfield, a cocaine addict and petty criminal who had been seen in the Villisca area around the time of the murders. Mansfield had a history of violence and had been suspected of involvement in other crimes throughout Iowa and neighboring states. His transient lifestyle and drug addiction made him an appealing suspect for investigators looking for someone capable of senseless violence. Mansfield was eventually arrested and charged with the Villisca murders, but the case against him was largely circumstantial. He had no clear connection to the Moore family, no apparent motive for killing them, and his presence in Villisca at the time of the murders could not be definitively established. The charges against Mansfield were eventually dropped when it became clear that the evidence was insufficient to support a conviction. The investigation also explored the possibility that the killer was someone suffering from severe mental illness, possibly what would now be recognized as a psychotic episode. This theory was supported by the bizarre post-murder behavior observed at the crime scene, the covering of mirrors, the placement of bacon beside each victim, the calm consumption of food while surrounded by carnage. Such behavior suggested a mind operating according to logic that was completely divorced from normal human responses. Religious fanatics and cult members were also considered as possible suspects, particularly given the ritualistic aspects of the crime scene. The systematic covering of mirrors and the placement of food items suggested possible religious or superstitious motivations, though no specific religious practices or beliefs could be identified that matched the killer's behavior. As months passed without any arrests or significant breakthroughs, the investigation began to consider increasingly exotic theories. Some suggested that the murders were connected to organized crime, possibly related to Joe Moore's business dealings or some unknown involvement in illegal activities. Others proposed that the killer was a deranged individual who selected his victims randomly, striking at the Moore family simply because they represented an available target. Chapter 10. The Community's Long Nightmare. As the investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders continued through the remainder of 1912 and into 1913, the community struggled to return to some semblance of normalcy while living under the shadow of an unsolved crime that had shattered their fundamental assumptions about safety and security. The failure of law enforcement to identify and apprehend the killer created a persistent sense of vulnerability that affected every aspect of daily life in the small Iowa town. The psychological impact of the murders on Villisca's residents was profound and lasting. Children who had once played freely in the streets now stayed close to home, their parents unwilling to let them out of sight. The simple pleasure of evening walks or sitting on front porches became activities fraught with anxiety, as residents found themselves constantly scanning the shadows for potential threats. The town that had once prided itself on neighborly trust now existed in a state of constant vigilance. The economic effects of the tragedy were also significant. Property values throughout Villisca declined as some residents decided to leave town entirely, unable to cope with the constant reminders of the horrific crime. Businesses suffered as tourism to the area dropped off, with potential visitors associating the town with violence and danger, rather than the peaceful agricultural community it had once been. The reputation of Villisca as a safe and wholesome place to raise a family had been permanently damaged. Religious faith, which had been a cornerstone of community life, was severely tested by the murders. Many residents struggled to understand how a benevolent God could have allowed such evil to befall an innocent family, particularly the young children who had died through no fault of their own. Church attendance initially increased as people sought comfort and answers, but some members of the community found their faith shaken beyond repair by the apparent randomness and brutality of the crime. The Moore house itself became a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen the community. Standing empty and abandoned, its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown, the house served as a physical manifestation of the fear and sadness that had settled over Villisca. Local children dared each other to approach the property, creating ghost stories and urban legends that would persist for decades. As the first anniversary of the murders approached in June of 1913, the community attempted to organize some form of memorial service for the victims. However, the event became a source of controversy as residents disagreed about whether such a service would provide healing closure or simply reopen wounds that had never properly healed. The deep divisions within the community about how to commemorate the tragedy reflected the ongoing trauma that continued to affect every aspect of life in Villisca. The investigation itself became a source of frustration and division within the community. Some residents criticized law enforcement for their perceived incompetence in failing to solve the case, while others defended the local officials as dedicated professionals doing their best under difficult circumstances. The involvement of outside investigators and reporters was welcomed by some as necessary expertise, but resented by others as unwanted interference in local affairs. Rumors and speculation about the killer's identity became a constant source of tension within the community. Neighbors began to view each other with suspicion, wondering if the person sitting next to them in church or shopping in the same store might be harboring dark secrets. Long-standing friendships were strained, as residents found themselves questioning the trustworthiness of people they had known for years. The media attention surrounding the case brought unwanted notoriety to Villisca, transforming it from an anonymous farming community into a symbol of American innocence lost. Reporters and curiosity seekers continued to arrive in town long after the initial investigation, treating the tragedy as a form of entertainment rather than recognizing the genuine suffering it had caused. This exploitation of their pain added an additional layer of trauma for residents who were already struggling to cope with their loss. Chapter 11: False Leads and Dead Ends. The investigation into the Villisca Axe murders generated hundreds of leads and potential suspects during its first year, but one by one, these promising avenues of inquiry led to disappointment and frustration. Each new theory that emerged seemed to offer hope for finally solving the case, only to collapse under closer examination when crucial evidence failed to materialize or when alibis proved unshakable. One of the most promising leads emerged in the fall of 1912 when investigators received reports of a man exhibiting suspicious behavior in a town approximately 50 miles from Villisca on the night of the murders. Witnesses described an individual covered in blood who had attempted to board a train, claiming to have been injured in a farming accident. The description provided by these witnesses seemed to match several of the suspects already under investigation, raising hopes that the killer's escape route had finally been identified. However, when investigators tracked down this individual, they discovered that he had indeed been injured in a legitimate accident involving farm equipment and had documentary evidence to support his story. The blood on his clothing was his own, the result of a severe laceration sustained while repairing machinery, and his presence in the area was easily explained by his work schedule. Another promising lead had evaporated under scrutiny. The discovery of a bloody shirt in a creek approximately 10 miles from Villisca generated considerable excitement among investigators who believed they might have found physical evidence left behind by the fleeing killer. The shirt appeared to have been discarded hastily, and its location along a route that could have been used to escape from the murder scene made it seem like a crucial piece of evidence. Laboratory analysis of the bloodstains was conducted using the limited forensic techniques available in 1912, but the results were inconclusive. Further investigation revealed that the bloody shirt belonged to a local farmer who had used it as a bandage after cutting himself while butchering a pig several days before the murders. The farmer had discarded the soiled garment in the creek without any knowledge of its potential significance to the investigation. Once again, what had appeared to be a breakthrough proved to be merely a coincidence. Reports of suspicious strangers in the area around the time of the murders were investigated with painstaking thoroughness, but none yielded any concrete connections to the crime. Traveling salesmen, itinerant workers, and other transients who had been in the vicinity were tracked down and questioned, often weeks or months after they had moved on to other locations. The mobile nature of many potential suspects made the investigation extremely difficult, requiring coordination between law enforcement agencies across multiple states. One particularly intriguing lead involved reports of a man seen washing blood from his hands and clothing at a creek near Villisca in the early morning hours of June 10th. Multiple witnesses claimed to have observed this individual, and their descriptions were consistent enough to suggest they were all referring to the same person. The timing of the sighting, approximately 3 hours after the estimated time of the murders, made it seem like investigators had finally identified the killer's escape route. Extensive searches of the creek and surrounding area were conducted in hopes of finding additional evidence that might have been discarded by the fleeing murderer. Investigators dragged the creek bed looking for weapons, clothing, or personal items that might provide clues to the killer's identity. Local volunteers joined the search, forming teams that combed through hundreds of acres of farmland and woodland in their determination to find any trace of evidence. The creek searches yielded numerous items that initially seemed promising: pieces of torn fabric, abandoned tools, even human hair caught on branches. But laboratory analysis repeatedly proved that none of these discoveries were connected to the murders. The bloody clothing observed by witnesses was eventually determined to belong to a local resident who had been cleaning fish caught during a nighttime expedition, completely unaware that his innocent activity would later be interpreted as evidence of murder. As the investigation expanded to include potential suspects from across the Midwest, the sheer volume of information became overwhelming for the small-town law enforcement officials managing the case. Filing systems that had been adequate for tracking minor crimes and civil disputes proved completely inadequate for organizing the massive amounts of documentation generated by a case of this magnitude. Important leads were sometimes overlooked or inadequately pursued, simply because they became lost in the chaos of paperwork. The involvement of multiple law enforcement agencies created additional complications, as jurisdictional disputes and communication breakdowns hampered the investigation. Information discovered by detectives in one location was not always shared promptly with investigators in other areas, leading to duplicated efforts and missed opportunities. The lack of standardized procedures for managing multi-jurisdictional investigations became a significant obstacle to solving the case. Chapter 12. The Trials of Reverend Kelly. The most significant development in the Villisca Axe Murders case came in 1916, when Reverend Lynn George Kelly was formally charged with the murders and brought to trial. Kelly had remained a person of interest throughout the 4 years since the crime, and investigators had continued to build a case against him based on circumstantial evidence and his suspicious behavior in the aftermath of the murders. The decision to prosecute Kelly was controversial from the beginning, dividing both the legal community and the residents of Villisca. Supporters of the prosecution argued that Kelly's presence in town at the time of the murders, combined with his unusual behavior and questionable background, made him the most viable suspect in a case where concrete evidence was virtually non-existent. Critics contended that the charges were based more on prejudice and desperation than on solid evidence, and that Kelly was being scapegoated for a crime that remained genuinely unsolved. The prosecution's case against Kelly relied heavily on testimony about his suspicious behavior and statements made in the days following the murders. Witnesses testified that Kelly had shown an inappropriate interest in the details of the crime, asking questions that seemed designed to determine how much investigators knew rather than expressing normal concern about the tragedy. His apparent lack of emotional response to the deaths of the children was cited as evidence of his guilt, though defense attorneys argued that people respond to trauma in different ways. Kelly's background became a central focus of the trial as prosecutors attempted to establish a pattern of unstable and potentially dangerous behavior. Evidence was presented about his dismissal from previous ministerial positions, though the specific reasons for these dismissals were often vague and based more on rumor than documented fact. The prosecution suggested that Kelly was a religious fanatic whose twisted interpretation of Scripture had led him to view the Moore family as deserving of divine punishment. The defense team, led by attorney James McNamara, argued that the case against Kelly was built entirely on suspicion and innuendo rather than actual evidence. They pointed out that no physical evidence connected Kelly to the crime scene, that no witnesses had seen him in the vicinity of the Moore house on the night of the murders, and that his motive for committing such a heinous act had never been clearly established. McNamara's defense strategy focused on highlighting the weaknesses in the investigation and the contamination of the crime scene that had occurred in the hours immediately following the discovery of the bodies. He argued that the failure to properly secure and examine the murder scene had made it impossible to determine what evidence might have existed, and that the prosecution was now trying to compensate for investigative failures by prosecuting an innocent man. The trial attracted national attention as reporters from major newspapers covered the proceedings with sensationalized accounts that often focused more on the gruesome details of the murders than on the legal questions surrounding Kelly's guilt or innocence. The media coverage created a carnival-like atmosphere around the courthouse, with vendors selling food and souvenirs to the crowds of curiosity seekers who had traveled to witness the trial. Testimony during the trial revealed the extent to which the investigation had been hampered by inexperience and poor procedures. Multiple witnesses admitted that they had trampled through the crime scene, potentially destroying evidence, and investigators acknowledged that crucial evidence might have been lost or contaminated during the initial examination of the Moore house. The prosecution's case was further weakened by the testimony of expert witnesses who questioned the reliability of some of the evidence that had been collected. The primitive forensic techniques available in 1916 made it difficult to establish definitive connections between suspects and crime scenes, and defense attorneys successfully raised doubts about the scientific validity of much of the physical evidence. After deliberating for approximately 25 hours, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, finding that the prosecution had failed to prove Kelly's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict was met with mixed reactions from the public, with some viewing it as a vindication of the American justice system's commitment to protecting the innocent, while others saw it as a failure to hold a guilty man accountable for his crimes. Kelly's acquittal effectively ended the most serious prosecution effort in the Villisca case, though he would later face a second trial on similar charges that also resulted in acquittal. The failure to convict Kelly left the community of Villisca without closure and ensured that the murders would remain officially unsolved, adding to the enduring mystery that continues to fascinate investigators and amateur sleuths more than a century later. Chapter 13. Other Suspects and Theories Revisited. Following Reverend Kelly's acquittal, the investigation into the Villisca Axe murders continued to pursue other suspects and theories, though with diminished resources and waning public interest. The failure to convict the most promising suspect had damaged confidence in law enforcement's ability to solve the case, but dedicated investigators refused to abandon their efforts to identify the killer and bring him to justice. Frank Fernando Jones remained under suspicion throughout the 1920s and 30s, though his wealth and political connections made him a difficult target for aggressive investigation. Jones had moved away from Villisca in the years following the murders, but private investigators hired by the victims' families continued to examine his possible involvement in the case. The business dispute between Jones and Joe Moore provided a clear motive for revenge, and Jones's knowledge of the Moore family's habits and routines would have made him an ideal candidate to plan such a precisely executed attack. New evidence emerged in the 1920s, suggesting that Jones might have hired William Blackie Mansfield to carry out the murders on his behalf. This theory proposed that Jones had provided Mansfield with detailed information about the Moore house and family, allowing the hired killer to strike with maximum efficiency while Jones maintained an alibi by remaining at home with his own family. The connection between Jones and Mansfield was never definitively established, but several witnesses claimed to have seen the two men together in the weeks before the murders. Mansfield himself became the subject of renewed investigation when he was arrested for an unrelated crime in 1916. While in custody, Mansfield allegedly made statements that could be interpreted as confessions to involvement in the Villisca murders, though these statements were often contradictory and made under circumstances that raised questions about their reliability. Mansfield's severe drug addiction affected his mental stability, making it difficult for investigators to determine whether his statements represented genuine confessions or the delusions of an addled mind. The theory that the Villisca murders were connected to a series of similar crimes throughout the Midwest gained credibility as investigators identified other axe murders that shared disturbing similarities with the Iowa case. Between 1911 and 1912, at least 23 people were killed in axe attacks across Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Colorado. The similarities between these crimes, the use of axes as weapons, the systematic covering of mirrors, the targeting of entire families, suggested the possibility of a serial killer operating across multiple states. The most compelling connection was to the murders of the Dawson family in Monmouth, Illinois, which occurred just 3 months before the Villisca tragedy. The Dawson case involved the axe murders of a family of 4, with the crime scene showing many of the same ritualistic elements observed in Villisca. The killer had covered mirrors throughout the house and had spent considerable time at the scene after completing the murders, behavior that was virtually identical to what had occurred at the Moore house. Investigators attempted to trace the movements of various suspects between the different crime scenes, looking for individuals who could have been present at multiple locations when the murders occurred. This approach was hampered by the limited record-keeping and communication systems of the early 20th century, which made it difficult to track the movements of transient individuals across state lines. The serial killer theory was further supported by the apparent randomness of victim selection in many of the cases. Unlike typical murders, which usually involve some connection between killer and victim, the axe murders seemed to target families who had no known enemies or involvement in activities that might provoke violence. This randomness suggested a killer who selected victims based on opportunity rather than personal grievance. Henry Lee Moore, a traveling minister who was Joe Moore's brother, emerged as another suspect when investigators discovered that he had been in the vicinity of several of the axe murder locations at the times when the crimes occurred. Henry Moore's itinerant lifestyle as a preacher took him throughout the Midwest, and his schedule coincided suspiciously with the timing of multiple murders. However, family members provided alibis for Henry Moore's whereabouts during some of the crucial time periods, and no definitive evidence was ever found linking him to any of the crimes. The investigation also explored theories involving organized crime and secret societies, though these lines of inquiry proved largely fruitless. Some investigators suggested that the murders might have been connected to labor disputes in the agricultural industry, with the Moore family targeted because of Joe Moore's business dealings or political affiliations. However, no evidence was ever found to support these theories, and they were eventually abandoned in favor of more promising leads. Chapter 14. The Cold Case endures. By the 1930s, the Villisca Axe Murders had officially become a cold case, though periodic revivals of interest would bring new investigators and new theories to examine the evidence. The passage of time had claimed many of the original witnesses and investigators, taking with them first-hand knowledge that might have provided crucial insights into the killer's identity and motives. The Moore house stood empty for many years after the murders, its reputation as the site of such horror making it impossible to sell or rent to new occupants. Local children developed elaborate folklore about the property, claiming that the ghosts of the murder victims still haunted the rooms where they had died. These ghost stories became part of Villisca's cultural identity, ensuring that the memory of the murders would be passed down from generation to generation. Attempts to demolish the house were met with resistance from historical preservationists, who argued that the building represented an important piece of American criminal history that should be maintained for educational and research purposes. The debate over the house's fate reflected the community's ambivalent relationship with its notorious past, a desire to move beyond the tragedy while recognizing its historical significance. In 1937, the house was purchased by Darwin and Martha Lynn, who announced their intention to restore the property and open it to the public as a historical site. The Lynns believed that preserving the house would serve educational purposes and help ensure that the victims of the murders would not be forgotten. However, their plans met with significant opposition from community members who felt that commercializing the tragedy was inappropriate and disrespectful to the memory of the dead. The investigation files from the original case were preserved in various law enforcement archives, though the organization and accessibility of these materials varied considerably. Some documents were maintained in excellent condition and remained available for researchers, while others were damaged by time, poor storage conditions, or simple neglect. The fragmented nature of the surviving evidence made comprehensive review of the case increasingly difficult as the years passed. Private investigators and amateur sleuths continued to examine the case throughout the mid-20th century, often focusing on aspects of the investigation that they believed had been inadequately explored by the original investigators. These unofficial inquiries sometimes generated new theories and interpretations of existing evidence, though none resulted in definitive solutions to the mystery. The development of new forensic techniques in the 1950s and 60s raised hopes that scientific analysis might finally provide answers to questions that had puzzled investigators for decades. However, the limited physical evidence that remained from the original crime scene was often too degraded or contaminated to yield useful results when subjected to modern testing methods. True crime writers and historians began to take serious interest in the Villisca case during the 1960s, producing books and articles that introduced the story to new audiences and sparked renewed public interest in solving the mystery. These publications often focused on the more sensational aspects of the case, sometimes at the expense of careful analysis of the available evidence. The rise of television crime documentaries in the 1970s brought the Villisca murders to national attention through programs that examined unsolved cases and mysterious crimes. These television presentations reached millions of viewers and generated thousands of tips and theories from amateur investigators who believed they had identified new leads or suspects. However, the vast majority of these tips proved to be based on speculation rather than factual evidence, and none resulted in significant breakthroughs in the case. The television coverage did serve to keep the story alive in popular culture, and ensured that new generations would learn about the murders and perhaps contribute to eventually solving them. Chapter 15. Modern Investigations and New Technologies. The advent of sophisticated forensic technologies in the late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new hope for solving the Villisca Axe murders, as investigators gained access to analytical techniques that were unimaginable when the crime was first committed. DNA analysis, advanced fingerprint examination, and computer-assisted investigation methods offered the possibility of extracting useful information from evidence that had been considered worthless by earlier generations of investigators. However, the application of modern forensic techniques to the Villisca case proved more challenging than initially anticipated. The contamination of the crime scene that had occurred in the hours immediately following the discovery of the bodies had destroyed or compromised much of the physical evidence that might have yielded useful DNA or fingerprint information. The numerous people who had tramped through the Moore house during the initial investigation had left behind their own biological traces, making it virtually impossible to isolate evidence that could be definitively attributed to the killer. The few items of physical evidence that remained from the original investigation were carefully examined using modern techniques, but the results were largely disappointing. The axe used in the murders had been handled by dozens of people over the years and stored under conditions that were not conducive to preserving forensic evidence. Any DNA or fingerprint evidence that might once have existed on the weapon had been destroyed by improper handling and the passage of time. In 2008, a team of cold case investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation announced that they were reopening the Villisca case using modern investigative techniques and computer databases that might reveal connections missed by earlier investigators. The announcement generated considerable media attention and renewed public interest in the century-old mystery. The modern investigation team applied geographic profiling techniques to analyze the pattern of axe murders that had occurred throughout the Midwest in the early 1900s. This analysis suggested that the crimes were indeed connected, and that they were likely committed by a single individual who was following transportation routes that allowed him to move efficiently between target communities. Computer analysis of the crime scenes and victim selection patterns revealed several previously unnoticed similarities between the various murders. The killer appeared to target families with children, often selecting homes that were located near churches or schools. The timing of the attacks frequently coincided with religious observances or community events, suggesting that the killer might have been using these gatherings to scout potential victims. The investigation team also employed psychological profiling techniques to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the type of individual who might have committed such crimes. The profile that emerged suggested a killer who was highly organized, possibly well-educated, and capable of blending into communities without arousing suspicion. The ritualistic elements of the crime scenes indicated someone with obsessive-compulsive tendencies and possibly religious delusions. Despite these technological advances and new analytical approaches, the modern investigation was ultimately unable to identify the killer or solve the case definitively. The passage of nearly a century had simply destroyed too much evidence and claimed too many witnesses for even the most sophisticated investigative techniques to overcome. In 2012, on the 100th anniversary of the murders, the town of Villisca organized a commemorative event to remember the victims and acknowledge the impact that the unsolved crime had had on their community. The ceremony drew hundreds of visitors, including descendants of the original investigators, true crime enthusiasts, and curiosity seekers drawn by the enduring mystery of the case. The anniversary event also featured presentations by modern investigators and forensic experts who discussed the challenges of solving century-old crimes and the limitations of applying contemporary techniques to historical evidence. These discussions helped educate the public about the realities of criminal investigation while maintaining respect for the memory of the victims. Chapter 16. Theories and speculation continue. More than a century after the Villisca Axe murders, the case continues to generate new theories and speculation from investigators, historians, and amateur sleuths who remain fascinated by the enduring mystery. The absence of a definitive solution has created a vacuum that continues to be filled by increasingly creative and sometimes far-fetched explanations for what happened on that terrible night in June 1912. One persistent theory suggests that the murders were committed by a member of an occult or satanic group that was operating in the Midwest during the early 20th century. Proponents of this theory point to the ritualistic elements of the crime scene, particularly the covering of mirrors and the placement of bacon beside each victim, as evidence of occult practices. However, Historical research has failed to identify any occult groups that were active in the Villisca area at the time, and the specific rituals observed at the crime scene do not correspond to any known occult practices. Another theory proposes that the killer was a government agent or military operative who was conducting some form of psychological experiment or testing new methods of assassination. This theory suggests that the Moore family was selected randomly as test subjects for techniques that might later be used against foreign enemies. The methodical nature of the killings and the killer's apparent lack of conventional motive are cited as evidence supporting this explanation, though no historical documentation has ever been found to substantiate such claims. The possibility that the murders were connected to labor disputes in the agricultural industry has been explored by several researchers who note that the early 20th century was a period of significant labor unrest throughout the Midwest. According to this theory, Joe Moore may have been targeted because of his opposition to union organizing efforts or his support for policies that were unfavorable to agricultural workers. However, no evidence has been found to suggest that Moore was involved in any significant labor conflicts, and the targeting of his entire family, including young children, seems disproportionate to any plausible labor-related motive. Some investigators have suggested that the killer was a woman, possibly someone who had developed an obsessive fixation on Joe Moore or who harbored jealousy towards Sarah Moore. This theory attempts to explain some of the more unusual aspects of the crime scene, such as the careful arrangement of the bodies and the domestic nature of some of the ritual behaviors. However, the physical strength required to wield an axe with sufficient force to kill 8 people makes it unlikely that the murderer was a woman acting alone. The serial killer theory remains one of the most compelling explanations for the Villisca murders, particularly given the similarities to other axe murders that occurred throughout the Midwest during the same time period. Modern criminal profilers have noted that the Villisca crime scene displays many characteristics associated with organized serial killers: careful planning, methodical execution, ritualistic behavior, and successful evasion of law enforcement. If the Villisca murders were indeed the work of a serial killer, they would represent one of the earliest documented cases of such criminal behavior in American history. The killer's ability to strike repeatedly across multiple states and then disappear completely suggests someone with considerable intelligence, mobility, and perhaps professional skills that facilitated travel and provided cover for his activities. The religious fanatic theory has gained renewed attention in recent years as researchers have explored the possibility that the killer was motivated by twisted religious beliefs that led him to view his victims as deserving of divine punishment. The targeting of families with children, the timing of attacks near religious observances, and the ritualistic elements of the crime scenes all support this interpretation. However, identifying specific religious beliefs or denominations that might have inspired such violence has proven difficult. Some contemporary investigators have suggested that the answer to the Villisca mystery may lie in family secrets or hidden relationships that were never fully explored by the original investigation. This theory proposes that the killer was someone intimately connected to the Moore family, perhaps a relative, close friend, or business associate who had access to the house and detailed knowledge of the family's routines. The motive for such a crime might have involved inheritance disputes, illicit relationships, or other personal conflicts that the family had successfully concealed from the community. The development of internet communities dedicated to unsolved crimes has created new forums for discussing and analyzing the Villisca case. Online investigators have used digital tools to examine crime scene photographs, analyze witness statements, and develop new theories about the killer's identity and motives. While these efforts have not solved the case, they have helped preserve interest in the story and have occasionally generated insights that have been overlooked by previous investigations. Chapter 17. The House That Horror Built. The Moore House at 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca stands today as perhaps the most tangible reminder of the tragedy that occurred within its walls more than a century ago. The 2-story white frame structure, which once represented the American dream of prosperity and family happiness, has been transformed by history into a monument to inexplicable evil and enduring mystery. After standing empty for decades following the murders, the house changed hands several times, with each new owner struggling to overcome the property's notorious reputation. Attempts to use the building as a residence were largely unsuccessful, as tenants reported disturbing experiences that they attributed to supernatural activity. Whether these experiences were genuine paranormal phenomena or psychological responses to the house's horrific history remains a matter of debate, but they contributed to the property's reputation as one of America's most haunted houses. In 1994, the house was purchased by Darwin and Martha Lynn, who undertook an extensive restoration project designed to return the building to its appearance on the night of the murders. The restoration was based on careful research of crime scene photographs, police reports, and survivor testimony, with the goal of creating an accurate historical representation of the murder scene. The Lynns opened the house to the public as a museum and educational site, offering guided tours that provided visitors with detailed information about the murders and the subsequent investigation. The tours proved popular with true crime enthusiasts, paranormal investigators, and curiosity seekers, generating enough revenue to maintain the property and fund ongoing research into the case. The decision to commercialize the murder site was controversial within the Villisca community, with some residents arguing that profiting from tragedy was disrespectful to the memory of the victims. Others supported the museum as an important educational resource that helped preserve the historical record and honored the victims by ensuring that their story would not be forgotten. Paranormal investigators began visiting the house in large numbers during the 1990s and 2000s, attracted by reports of ghost sightings, unexplained sounds, and other supernatural phenomena. These investigations were often filmed for television programs dedicated to exploring haunted locations, bringing national attention to the house and the story of the murders. The paranormal investigations have produced numerous claims of contact with the spirits of the murder victims, though skeptics argue that these experiences can be explained by suggestion, environmental factors, and the psychological impact of being in a location associated with such violence. Regardless of one's beliefs about the supernatural, the house clearly continues to exert a powerful emotional impact on visitors who are confronted with the reality of what occurred there. In 2006, the house was featured in a major motion picture that dramatized the story of the murders and their impact on the community. The film brought renewed attention to the case and introduced the story to a new generation of viewers who had never heard of the Villisca murders. While the movie took some dramatic liberties with historical facts, it generally treated the subject matter with appropriate seriousness and respect for the victims. The house has also served as a venue for serious historical research, with investigators and scholars using the property to conduct experiments designed to better understand the logistics of the crime. These studies have examined questions such as how the killer moved through the house, how long the murders would have taken to complete, and whether the sounds of the attacks would have been audible to neighbors. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House operates as both a museum and overnight accommodation for visitors who want to experience spending a night in the historic building. These overnight stays are popular with paranormal enthusiasts and true crime fans who hope to gain insights into the case by immersing themselves in the environment where the murders occurred. The house serves as a pilgrimage destination for people fascinated by unsolved crimes and American criminal history. Visitors come from around the world to see the location where one of the nation's most notorious murders took place, and many report being deeply moved by the experience of standing in the rooms where 8 innocent people lost their lives. Epilogue: A Century of Questions. As we reach the conclusion of this examination of the Villisca Axe murders, we find ourselves confronting the same questions that have puzzled investigators for more than 100 years. Who killed the Moore family and their young guests on that terrible night in June 1912? What motivated such a brutal and seemingly senseless crime? Why has this case resisted every effort at solution despite the attention of countless investigators, both professional and amateur? The story of the Villisca murders is ultimately a story about the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of mystery in an age that often assumes that all questions can be answered through technology and determination. Despite advances in forensic science, criminal profiling, and investigative techniques that would have seemed miraculous to the original investigators, the essential facts of the case remain as elusive as they were on June 10, 1912. Perhaps the enduring fascination with the Villisca case stems from its representation of the vulnerability of ordinary people to extraordinary evil. The Moore family was not wealthy enough to attract kidnappers, prominent enough to have political enemies, or involved in activities dangerous enough to provoke revenge. They were simply a middle-class family living quiet lives in a small town, making them representative of millions of American families who trust in the basic safety and security of their communities. The murders shattered that trust not only for the residents of Villisca, but for anyone who heard the story and recognized that such violence could strike anywhere, without warning or apparent reason. The randomness of the crime, if indeed it was random, serves as a reminder that evil can touch any life at any time, regardless of one's precautions or moral standing. The investigation into the Villisca murders also reflects the evolution of American law enforcement from the amateur, localized agencies of the early 20th century to the sophisticated, interconnected system that exists today. The mistakes made by the original investigators, the contamination of the crime scene, the failure to preserve evidence, the lack of coordination between agencies, seem obvious in hindsight, but were understandable given the limited resources and experience available to rural law enforcement in 1912. The case serves as a reminder of how much our understanding of criminal behavior and investigation techniques has advanced over the past century. The concept of serial killers was virtually unknown in 1912, making it difficult for investigators to recognize patterns that seem obvious to modern observers. Similarly, the psychological profiling techniques that are standard practice today were not available to help investigators understand the type of person who might commit such crimes. Yet despite all these advances, the Villisca case remains unsolved, suggesting that some mysteries may be beyond the reach of even our most sophisticated investigative techniques. The passage of time has claimed witnesses, degraded evidence, and obscured the historical record in ways that may make definitive solution impossible. The victims of the Villisca murders, Josiah and Sarah Moore, their children Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, and their young guests Lena and Ina Stillinger, deserve to be remembered not merely as the subjects of an unsolved mystery, but as real people whose lives were cut short by violence. They were individuals with dreams, fears, hopes, and aspirations that were destroyed by an act of inexplicable cruelty. The story of their deaths has become part of American folklore, joining other unsolved cases that capture the public imagination and refuse to be forgotten. Their memory is preserved not only in the historical record but in the continued efforts of investigators who refuse to give up hope that someday, somehow, the truth about what happened on that night in Villisca will finally be revealed. Until that day arrives, if it ever does, the Villisca Axe Murders will remain one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the facade of ordinary life and the limitations of human understanding in the face of inexplicable evil. The case continues to challenge our assumptions about safety, justice, and the possibility of finding answers to life's most troubling questions. The house on East 2nd Street still stands as a monument to these 8 victims and to the enduring mystery of their deaths. Visitors who walk through its rooms and stand where such horror once occurred are confronted with fundamental questions about human nature, the reality of evil, and the fragility of life itself. In the end, the Villisca Axe Murders represent more than just an unsolved crime. They are a window into the darker aspects of the human experience and a reminder that some questions may never be fully answered, no matter how desperately we seek the truth. The mystery endures, as haunting and compelling today as it was more than a century ago when 8 innocent lives were lost in a small Iowa town that would never be the same again. The Villisca Axe Murders remain one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries, a case that has defied resolution for more than a century, despite the tireless efforts of countless investigators. 8 innocent lives were lost on that terrible night in June 1912, and their killer was never brought to justice. But their story lives on, not just as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of seeking truth, even when that truth seems impossible to find. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters deserve to be remembered not merely as victims of an unsolved crime, but as real people whose lives had meaning and value. At True Crime Open and Closed, we believe that every unsolved case deserves to be told with dignity and respect. These stories matter because the victims mattered, and because justice delayed should never mean justice denied. If you have information about this case or any other unsolved crime, we encourage you to contact the appropriate authorities. Sometimes the smallest detail can crack open a case that has been cold for decades. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, this has been True Crime Open and Closed, where we never stop searching for the truth in the shadows of history.